Margaret Stone sat by the large window of the penthouse apartment and watched the city below move in complete silence. She was 78 years old and had been deaf since the day she was born. The world had never made a sound for her, and she had learned to live in her own quiet universe. Her son Richard had become one of the richest men in the country. He owned a technology company that made billions of dollars every year. He had worked hard his entire life to give his mother everything she could ever want. The penthouse was beautiful with expensive furniture and paintings on every wall. Margaret had caregivers who helped her with everything she needed. They brought her food and helped her get dressed and made sure she took her medicine on time. But there was one thing Richard could not buy for his mother, and that was the ability to talk to her. Margaret had never learned sign language because when she was growing up in the small town in Kentucky, there were no schools for deaf children. There were no teachers who knew how to help her. Her parents and brothers and sisters had created their own way of talking to her, using hand movements and gestures that only their family understood. It was a language that belonged only to them. But over the years her parents died and her brothers and sisters moved away and passed on. The language died with them, and now Margaret was the only person left who remembered it. Richard had tried everything to help his mother communicate with the world. He hired the best interpreters and speech therapists and doctors who specialized in deafness. He flew in experts from other countries who promised they could help. But nothing worked because Margaret's language was too personal and too unique. Without someone who knew the original signs, there was no way to learn it. The caregivers did their best to understand what Margaret wanted. They pointed at things and used simple gestures and tried to guess what she needed. Margaret would nod yes or shake her head no, but anything more complicated than that was impossible. She could not tell them about her day or share a memory or explain how she was feeling. All of those thoughts stayed locked inside her mind with no way out. Richard watched his mother from across the room and felt a deep sadness in his chest. He had given her luxury and comfort, and the finest medical care that money could buy, but he could not give her what she needed most, which was someone to truly understand her. He saw the frustration in her eyes when she tried to communicate something important, and no one could understand. He saw the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people but still being completely alone. Margaret spent most of her days sitting by the window and watching the people on the streets below. She wondered what they were saying to each other. She watched mothers talking to their children and friends laughing together and couples holding hands. She had never been able to have those easy conversations that everyone else took for granted. Even with her own son, there was a wall between them that neither could break through. Richard would sit with her and hold her hand, and she would smile at him. But he never knew what she was thinking or remembering. He did not know the stories from her childhood or what she dreamed about at night. He knew she loved him because he could see it in her eyes, but she could never tell him in words or signs. The caregivers changed shifts throughout the day, and they were all kind and patient. Helen was the main caregiver during the daytime hours, and she had been working with Margaret for 2 years. She had learned to read some of Margaret's basic needs, but anything beyond that was a mystery. Helen would bring Margaret her meals and help her move from the wheelchair to the couch and make sure she was comfortable. But when Margaret tried to tell her something more complicated, Helen could only offer an apologetic smile and hope that Margaret understood she was trying her best. Margaret had learned to keep her thoughts to herself over the years. There was no point in trying to share them when no one could understand. She lived in her memories instead. She thought about her childhood on the farm and the way the sun felt on her face when she was young. She remembered her mother's hands moving in their special language and the way her father would pat her head when she did something good. Those memories were all she had left of the time when someone truly understood her. The penthouse had everything a person could want, but it felt like a beautiful prison to Margaret. She was grateful for her son's success, and she knew he loved her deeply. But she would have traded all the expensive furniture and fancy meals for just one person who could talk to her in the language she knew. Richard left for work early every morning and came home late at night. His company required constant attention, and there were always meetings and decisions that needed to be made. But even when he was at work, he thought about his mother sitting alone in that big apartment. He had tried so many times to reach her and failed every time. The experts had told him that without documentation of her original family signs, it would be impossible to recreate the language. They said the best they could do was teach Margaret some basic gestures that everyone could understand, but Margaret was too old to learn a completely new system. Her mind still worked in the language of her childhood, and nothing else made sense to her. So Margaret continued to sit by the window day after day and watch the world move in silence. She was surrounded by people who cared for her body, but no one could reach her mind or her heart. She had accepted this as her reality and had stopped hoping that things would change. After all, she had lived 78 years in this silent world, and she knew that some things could not be fixed, no matter how much money or effort was spent trying. Marcus Johnson was 10 years old and lived with his grandmother Betty in a small apartment across town. The apartment building was old and the paint was peeling off the walls, but it was home. Marcus had lived there since he was 3 years old when his mother left and never came back. Betty had taken him in without hesitation and raised him as her own. She worked as a housekeeper and cleaned offices and apartments to pay the bills. Money was always tight, but Betty made sure Marcus had everything he needed. She bought his school supplies and made sure he had clean clothes and cooked him dinner every night. Marcus was a quiet child who spent most of his time observing the world around him. While other kids played video games or watched television, Marcus liked to watch people. He sat on the apartment steps and watched neighbors coming and going. He studied the way they walked and talked and expressed themselves. He noticed things that other people missed. At school, Marcus sat in the back of the classroom and rarely spoke up. Teachers thought he was shy or not very bright because he did not raise his hand or participate in discussions. But Marcus was paying attention to everything. He listened to every word and watched every movement and absorbed information like a sponge. He just did not see the need to talk unless he had something important to say. Marcus had discovered silent films at the public library one rainy Saturday afternoon. The librarian had set up a small film festival in the community room and was showing old movies from the 1920s. Marcus wandered in out of curiosity and found himself mesmerized by what he saw on the screen. The actors told entire stories without speaking a single word. They used their faces and bodies and hands to express every emotion and thought. Charlie Chaplin made people laugh without saying anything funny. Buster Keaton showed fear and courage through nothing but his expressions. Marcus watched these films over and over and began to understand that communication was much more than just words. After that day, Marcus spent hours at the library watching every silent film they had. He studied the way actors moved and gestured. He learned that a tilt of the head could mean curiosity, and a slouch of the shoulders could mean defeat. He saw that eyes could speak volumes and hands could paint pictures in the air. This fascinated him in a way that nothing else ever had. Betty noticed her grandson's interest in the old films, but she did not understand it. She worried that Marcus did not have friends his own age and spent too much time alone. But Marcus was happy in his own world. He did not feel lonely because he was constantly learning and discovering new things about how people communicated without words. One Thursday afternoon, Betty came home from work with news that made her both excited and nervous. Her cleaning agency had called with a special job offer. A very wealthy client needed a deep cleaning of a penthouse apartment, and the pay was 3 times her normal rate. The only problem was that her regular babysitter was sick, and she would have to bring Marcus with her. Betty did not like bringing her grandson to work because she wanted to appear professional. But the money was too good to turn down. They needed it to pay the rent and buy groceries and fix the washing machine that had broken last week. So she told the agency she would take the job and made Marcus promise to behave. Marcus promised he would be good and sit quietly and not touch anything. He was actually excited about going to the penthouse because he was curious about how rich people lived. He had never been in a fancy building before and wondered what it would be like. Betty packed her cleaning supplies and made Marcus pack a book to read while she worked. They took 2 buses to get to the building. Because they did not have a car, the bus ride took almost an hour, and Marcus looked out the window the whole time watching the neighborhoods change from poor to middle class to wealthy. When they finally arrived at the building, Marcus looked up and could not see the top. It was the tallest building he had ever seen. The doorman looked at Betty and Marcus with suspicion until Betty showed him the work order from the agency. Then he let them inside and directed them to the service elevator. The elevator was fancier than Marcus's entire apartment. It had mirrors on the walls and soft music playing from hidden speakers. Marcus watched the numbers light up as they rose higher and higher. When they reached the top floor, Betty took a deep breath and straightened her uniform. She reminded Marcus one more time to be on his best behavior and not to embarrass her. Marcus nodded seriously and followed his grandmother out of the elevator. A woman named Helen answered the door and welcomed them inside. She was the daytime caregiver, and she showed Betty what needed to be cleaned. The penthouse was enormous, and Marcus felt like he had stepped into a magazine. Everything was perfect and expensive and spotless. He wondered why it even needed cleaning if it was already so clean. Betty told Marcus to sit in a chair near the entrance and stay there until she was finished working. Marcus sat down with his book, but he did not open it. Instead, he looked around the apartment with wide eyes. That was when he saw the old woman sitting by the window in a wheelchair. She had white hair and wrinkled hands, and she was staring out at the city below. Marcus watched her for a moment and noticed something about the way she sat. She looked sad and lonely even though she was in this beautiful place. Helen brought the old woman a cup of tea and tried to talk to her. But the woman just looked at Helen with confusion. Helen pointed at the tea and made drinking gestures. The woman nodded politely, but Marcus could tell she did not understand what Helen was really trying to say. Then the woman began making movements with her hands. They were quick and fluid, like she was speaking with her fingers. But Helen just looked confused and shrugged her shoulders. The woman's face showed frustration, and she made the hand movements again more slowly. Helen shook her head apologetically and patted the woman's shoulder. Marcus found this fascinating. The woman was trying to communicate something, but no one understood her language. He had seen this before in his silent films when actors had to express complex ideas through gestures alone. But this was real life, and the stakes seemed much higher. Marcus could not stop watching the old woman by the window. Betty had gone to another room to start cleaning, and Helen was in the kitchen washing dishes. The woman sat alone making small gestures to herself, like she was having a conversation that only she could hear. Marcus knew he had promised to stay in his chair, but something pulled him forward. He stood up slowly and walked toward the woman. She must have sensed his movement because she turned her wheelchair to face him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Marcus saw intelligence in her eyes and sadness and something else that he recognized. It was the same feeling he had when teachers ignored him at school, or when other kids excluded him from their games. It was the feeling of not being heard. The woman looked at Marcus with curiosity. Most people avoided looking at her directly because they did not know how to interact with her, but this boy was different. He looked at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. Margaret studied the young boy standing before her. He was thin and wore clothes that had been washed too many times. But his eyes were alert and focused in a way that was unusual for a child. She decided to test him. She made a simple gesture, pointing to the window and then making a motion with her hand. It was the same gesture she had tried to show Helen earlier. Marcus watched her hand movements carefully. He thought about what she might be trying to say. The gesture looked like something opening or moving. He remembered seeing something similar in one of his silent films when an actor wanted to show wind or air. He looked at the closed window and then back at the woman. She was pointing at the window and making a flowing motion. Maybe she wanted the window open. Marcus walked to the window and looked back at her for confirmation. She nodded eagerly and made the gesture again. He unlocked the window latch and pushed it open just a little. Cool spring air flowed into the room, bringing the smell of the city with it. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. It was a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. She had been trying to tell Helen for days that she wanted fresh air, but no one had understood. This boy had figured it out in less than a minute. Helen came out of the kitchen and saw Marcus at the window. She started to scold him for leaving his seat, but then she saw Margaret's face. The old woman looked happier than Helen had seen her in months. Helen stopped mid-sentence and just watched. Marcus turned back to Margaret, and she immediately began making more gestures. She was excited now, and her hands moved faster. Marcus tried to keep up, but some of the movements were too quick or too complex. He held up his hand to slow her down, and surprisingly she did. She repeated the gestures more slowly and deliberately. She pointed to a photograph on the side table, and then made a series of hand movements. Marcus picked up the photograph and brought it closer to her. It showed Margaret when she was younger, standing with a man and 3 children in front of a farmhouse. Margaret touched the glass gently and then made a gesture that seemed to indicate something far away or long ago. She touched her heart and then made a scattering motion with her fingers. Marcus did not understand all of it, but he understood the emotion. She was remembering people who were gone. He knew what that felt like because his own mother was gone too. He touched his own heart and nodded to show he understood loss. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Someone finally understood what she was trying to say. Betty came into the room and nearly dropped her bucket of cleaning supplies when she saw her grandson interacting with Mrs. Stone. She rushed over to pull Marcus away and apologize, but Helen stopped her. Helen explained that Marcus had just done something no one else had been able to do. He had actually communicated with Margaret. Betty looked confused and worried. She did not want Marcus to get in trouble or cause any problems. But Helen assured her that this was a good thing. Margaret was gesturing to Marcus again, and he was watching intently. She made a movement that looked like eating, and then pointed to herself. Marcus thought for a moment and then pointed to the clock on the wall and made a questioning gesture. Was she asking about dinner time? Margaret shook her head and tried again. This time she made the eating gesture and then patted her stomach and made a face. Marcus understood. The food was upsetting her stomach. He looked at Helen and explained what he thought Margaret was trying to say. Helen's eyes widened because she had noticed that Margaret had not been eating much lately, but did not know why. She asked Marcus to ask Margaret what kind of food she wanted instead. Marcus turned back to Margaret, and this was harder. He did not know how to ask a question in her language. He tried pointing to different things around the room and making gestures, but Margaret looked confused. Then Marcus remembered something from his silent films. The actors would sometimes act out what they wanted to show. He pretended to eat different types of food and made faces to show which ones were good and which were bad. Margaret watched him and then started laughing. It was a silent laugh because she had never heard laughter, but Marcus could see the joy in her face. She began acting things out too. She pretended to eat something soft and smooth, and her face showed pleasure. Helen thought for a moment and then suggested soup. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. For the next hour, while Betty finished cleaning, Marcus and Margaret continued their unusual conversation. It was imperfect and filled with misunderstandings. Marcus would guess wrong and Margaret would shake her head and try again. But slowly they began to find a rhythm. Margaret would make a gesture and Marcus would watch carefully and try to find the pattern or meaning. Some gestures were obvious, like pointing to things or acting out actions, but others were more abstract and required Marcus to think about what she might mean. He realized that some of her gestures were like the ones in his silent films, but others were completely unique to her. When it was time to leave, Betty apologized again to Helen for any trouble Marcus might have caused. But Helen just smiled and thanked them. She said that Marcus had given Margaret something precious, which was the feeling of being understood. On the bus ride home, Marcus was quiet, but his mind was racing. He kept replaying every gesture and every expression in his head. He had discovered something important, though he could not put it into words yet. There was an entire language that was disappearing, and somehow he could begin to understand it. Betty looked at her grandson and saw something different in his face. He looked focused and determined in a way she had never seen before. She did not fully understand what had happened in that penthouse, but she could tell it was significant. Richard Stone came home that evening tired from a long day of meetings. His company was negotiating a major deal and the pressure was intense. All he wanted was a quiet dinner and maybe a chance to sit with his mother for a while, even if they could not really talk. But Helen was waiting for him at the door with an excited expression on her face. She immediately began telling him about the boy who had visited that day and how he had communicated with Margaret. Richard loosened his tie and listened with only half his attention. He had heard stories like this before. People who claimed they could reach his mother or who thought they had found a breakthrough. It always ended in disappointment. Helen insisted this was different. She told him about the window and the photograph and the conversation about food. She said Margaret had been more engaged and happy than she had been in months. Richard looked over at his mother, who was eating her dinner. She did seem different somehow, less withdrawn and more present, but he was not ready to get his hopes up again. He had been disappointed too many times. He asked Helen about the boy and learned his name was Marcus Johnson, and his grandmother Betty was the housekeeper who had visited. Richard made a decision. He told Helen to contact the cleaning agency and arrange for Betty to come back. He wanted to see this supposed communication for himself. 3 days later, Betty received a phone call that confused her. The agency said Mr. Stone himself wanted to hire her for regular work at the penthouse. They mentioned that he specifically requested she bring her grandson Marcus. The pay they offered was so high that Betty thought they had made a mistake. She called back to confirm, and they assured her the amount was correct. Betty told Marcus about the job and saw his face light up with excitement. He had been thinking about Margaret constantly since their visit. He had even started a notebook where he drew the gestures he remembered, and tried to figure out what they meant. He filled pages with stick figures and arrows and notes to himself. When they arrived at the penthouse for the second time, Richard Stone was there waiting. He was a tall man with gray hair at his temples and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Marcus felt small and nervous standing in front of him. Richard shook Marcus's hand and studied the boy carefully. He did not look like anything special, just a thin kid with worn-out shoes and a backpack. But Helen had insisted there was something different about him. Richard asked Marcus to show him what he could do. Marcus approached Margaret slowly. His heart was pounding and his hands felt sweaty. What if it did not work this time? What if the first visit had just been luck? But when Margaret saw him, her whole face changed. She recognized him immediately and began gesturing with excitement. Marcus took a deep breath and focused on her hands. Margaret made a series of movements and Marcus frowned in concentration. He pointed to a plant in the corner and made a watering motion. Margaret shook her head and repeated the gesture more slowly. Marcus tried again. This time he pointed to the sunlight coming through the window. Margaret nodded with enthusiasm and continued with more gestures. Richard watched in amazement as his mother and this young boy went back and forth. It was not perfect and there were clearly misunderstandings, but it was real communication. His mother was trying to tell the boy something and the boy was actually understanding parts of it. Richard asked Marcus how he was doing this. Marcus turned to face him and tried to explain. He said that Margaret had patterns in her gestures like a code. Some signs looked like the things she was talking about. Other signs were more abstract, but they followed rules. He showed Richard a flowing motion that meant time passing, and a sharp, quick movement that meant something specific or important. Richard was skeptical but curious. He asked where Marcus had learned this skill. Marcus explained that he had not learned it anywhere. He just watched people carefully and studied silent films at the library. He said communication was bigger than just words, and if you paid attention, you could understand what people meant even without language. Over the next few weeks, Marcus came to the penthouse every day after school. Betty would finish her work in other parts of the building, while Marcus spent time with Margaret. What had started as curiosity became a mission for Marcus. He was determined to understand Margaret's complete language. He filled notebook after notebook with drawings of her gestures. He wrote down what he thought each gesture meant and tested his theories the next day. Some signs were easy to figure out. When Margaret made a circle motion near her face, she was talking about the sun or daytime. When she made a downward motion with her hands, she meant sadness or something bad. But other signs were much harder. Margaret had abstract concepts that required multiple gestures to express. She had ways of talking about time and memory and emotion that were complex and nuanced. Margaret seemed to come alive during these sessions. Having someone truly trying to understand her awakened something that had been sleeping for years. She began teaching Marcus intentionally. She would make a gesture and wait for him to repeat it back. If he got it wrong, she would correct him patiently. If he got it right, she would smile and move on to the next one. Richard watched these sessions whenever he could. He started coming home earlier from work just to see his mother and Marcus together. Through Marcus's rough translations, he began to learn things about his mother he had never known. She told stories about her childhood on the farm. She described watching barn dances through the window because her parents would not let her attend. She talked about a boy she had loved when she was 16 who went to war and never came back. These were stories Richard had never heard because there had never been a way for his mother to tell them. He realized how much of her life had remained hidden inside her all these years. He felt grateful to Marcus but also sad about all the lost time. Betty watched her grandson change during this period. At school, Marcus was still quiet and withdrawn. But at the penthouse, he was confident and focused. Teachers had always underestimated him, but here he was essential. He was doing something important that no one else could do. Word began to spread about the boy who could speak a lost language. Richard had always been private about his family life, but he started to realize that Marcus's ability meant something bigger than just helping his mother. There were other elderly deaf people out there who had their own unique sign systems that were disappearing. People who had been isolated for decades because no one could understand their personal languages. A reporter from the local news station heard about the story through a friend who worked at the university. She called Richard's office and asked if she could do a feature about Marcus and Margaret. Richard was hesitant at first. He did not want to exploit his mother or put Marcus in an uncomfortable position. But when he mentioned the idea to Betty, she surprised him by encouraging it. Betty said that people needed to see what Marcus could do. They needed to understand that just because someone communicated differently did not mean they had nothing to say. Too many people were invisible in society because others did not take the time to understand them. Richard talked to Marcus about it, and the boy agreed, even though he was nervous about being on television. Marcus said if it could help other people like Margaret, then it was worth doing. The news crew came to the penthouse on a Saturday morning. The reporter was a kind woman named Linda, who immediately put everyone at ease. She interviewed Richard first, and he explained his mother's situation and how Marcus had succeeded where experts had failed. Then Linda interviewed Marcus. He sat on the couch looking small and serious and explained his process. He talked about watching silent films and learning that communication was about more than words. He said everyone had their own way of expressing themselves, and all you had to do was pay attention. The most powerful part of the segment was watching Marcus and Margaret together. The camera captured Margaret making her unique gestures and Marcus carefully interpreting them. It showed the joy on Margaret's face when Marcus understood what she was saying. It showed the patience and focus Marcus brought to every interaction. Linda, the reporter, explained in her voiceover how this 10-year-old boy had given an isolated woman her voice back. She talked about the thousands of elderly deaf individuals who might be in similar situations, people who had fallen through the cracks of the system and were living in silence. The segment aired on a Thursday evening, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The television station received hundreds of phone calls and emails. Some were from families desperately seeking help for their own deaf relatives who could not communicate. Others were from researchers and linguists who were fascinated by the phenomenon of personal sign languages. A few calls came from elderly deaf people themselves who had been isolated for years and wanted someone to understand them. Richard was not prepared for the volume of response. His office received calls too. People wanted to hire Marcus or wanted to know if there was a program that could help them. Some people criticized the story, saying it made light of deafness or that Richard should have done more for his mother sooner. But most responses were positive and hopeful. Richard realized he had an opportunity to do something meaningful. He had more money than he could ever spend, and here was a chance to use it for good. He decided to fund a program at the local university to study and preserve personal sign languages before they disappeared forever. The program would send researchers to work with families who had developed their own communication systems. They would document these languages and create records so they would not be lost when the older generation passed away. But more importantly, Richard wanted to create a training program based on Marcus's approach, not teaching the specific signs because those were unique to each person, but teaching the methodology, how to observe carefully, how to look for patterns, how to connect with someone without using conventional language. Marcus became the youngest consultant for the program. University professors and graduate students came to watch him work with Margaret. They took notes and asked questions and tried to understand his intuitive process. Many of them struggled to replicate what Marcus did. They had too much formal education and too many theories about how communication should work. Their training actually got in the way of simply observing and responding, but a few students began to grasp the approach. They were usually the ones who came from non-traditional backgrounds themselves, students who had experienced being misunderstood or overlooked. They learned to set aside their assumptions and just watch and listen with their eyes and respond with their presence. The program started working with families in the area who had similar situations. There was an elderly man whose family had created signs for him when he was young. There was a woman who had been deaf and blind since childhood and communicated through touch. There were people who had been institutionalized for years and had developed signs with other residents. Each case was unique and required patience and dedication. The students who worked best were the ones who approached each person as an individual rather than trying to apply a universal system. Richard funded scholarships for students who wanted to specialize in this area. He provided grants for research and documentation. He made sure that Marcus and Betty were taken care of financially, so Marcus could continue his work without worry. Betty had been promoted to head caregiver for Margaret. She understood now how important real communication was, and she made sure all the staff at the penthouse respected Margaret's language. Marcus taught the other caregivers some of the basic signs so they could meet Margaret's daily needs. But Marcus remained the one who could have deep conversations with her. He was the one who could translate her stories and memories. The local news station did a follow-up story 6 months later. It showed how the university program had grown and how many families had been helped. It featured interviews with people who had been isolated for decades and were now able to communicate with their loved ones. The second story got even more attention than the first. National news outlets picked it up, and soon people across the country were talking about the boy who could speak lost languages. Marcus handled the attention with quiet dignity. He did not like being famous, but he understood it was bringing awareness to an important issue. He continued to go to school and live his normal life as much as possible. As months passed, Marcus became more fluent in Margaret's language. He could now understand complex thoughts and emotions that she expressed. He could tell when she was talking about the past versus the present. He learned the subtle differences in her gestures that indicated questions versus statements. Margaret taught him about her life in Kentucky, growing up on a farm with 7 brothers and sisters. She had been the youngest and the only deaf one in the family. Her parents had loved her, but they did not know how to help her get an education or connect with the wider world. So she stayed on the farm and helped with chores and learned the family's private language. Marcus translated these stories for Richard, who listened with a mixture of joy and sadness. He was learning about his mother's childhood for the first time in his life. She told him through Marcus about how she would sneak out at night to watch the barn dances from outside. She could not hear the music, but she could see the people moving and feel the vibrations through the ground. She had loved watching the couple spin around the floor. Richard learned that his mother had wanted to dance more than anything. She had practiced alone in the barn, moving to rhythms only she could feel. But she never got to dance with a partner because no one in town knew how to dance with a deaf girl. One evening, Richard asked Marcus to ask his mother about his father. Margaret's face grew soft and sad. She began making gestures that told a story Marcus had to piece together slowly. She had met Richard's father at a church picnic when she was 20. He was a traveling salesman who had stopped in town for a few days. Most men ignored Margaret because of her deafness, but this man had been different. He had taken the time to communicate with her using gestures and expressions. They had fallen in love quickly. He had promised to take her away from the small town and give her a better life. But after Richard was born, the man had left. He could not handle the responsibility of a family, and he disappeared one day while Margaret was sleeping. She never saw him again. Richard had known his father abandoned them, but he had never known the details. He felt anger at the man who had left his mother alone with a baby, but he also felt grateful because that abandonment had made him determined to take care of his mother no matter what. Marcus continued to document Margaret's language in his notebooks. He now had 5 notebooks completely filled with drawings and notes. He had created a kind of dictionary that others could use to communicate with Margaret in basic ways. But Marcus knew that the deeper understanding came from spending time with her and learning the context behind each gesture. The university researchers were impressed with Marcus's documentation. They asked if they could make copies to study, and Marcus agreed. Some of the professors wanted to create a formal system out of Margaret's signs, but Marcus argued against it. He explained that the language was personal and organic. Trying to make it rigid and formal would destroy what made it special. Richard supported Marcus's view. He funded the documentation and preservation of these personal languages, but insisted they be kept authentic and individual. He did not want his mother's unique way of communicating to be turned into something academic and cold. Marcus's relationship with Margaret had grown beyond just language learning. She had become like a grandmother to him. She worried about his schoolwork and whether he was eating enough. She made Richard buy Marcus new clothes because she noticed his shoes had holes in them. Margaret even convinced Richard through Marcus to hire a tutor for the boy. Marcus was smart, but he had fallen behind in some subjects because teachers overlooked him. With one-on-one attention, Marcus began to excel. His grades improved dramatically, and teachers started to notice him in class. Betty watched her grandson flourish and felt grateful beyond words. Richard had essentially adopted them into his life. He paid Betty a generous salary and provided health insurance and gave Marcus opportunities she could never have afforded. But Richard insisted he was the one who should be grateful. Marcus spent his afternoons after school at the penthouse. He would do his homework at the dining table while Margaret sat nearby. Sometimes they would take breaks, and Marcus would tell her about his day using the mixture of her signs and gestures they had developed together. Margaret would respond with advice or encouragement. She reminded Marcus in many ways of his own grandmother Betty. Both women had lived hard lives and survived through strength and determination. Both had raised children largely alone. Both had more wisdom than the world had given them credit for. One day, Marcus asked Margaret through a series of gestures what she had always wanted to do but never got the chance. Margaret thought for a long time. Then she made gestures that Marcus interpreted as wanting to help other people who felt invisible like she had. Marcus told Richard about this conversation. Richard was moved by his mother's desire to help others even after all she had suffered. He asked Marcus to ask her how she would want to help if she could. Margaret's response was immediate. She wanted there to be places where people who communicated differently could come together, places where they would not be judged or misunderstood, where they could find others who took the time to truly listen. Richard was inspired by this idea. He began planning a community center that would serve deaf individuals and others with communication differences. It would have teachers trained in Marcus's observation methods. It would be a place of connection rather than isolation. Marcus helped design parts of the program based on what he had learned from Margaret. He suggested having mentorship programs, where people who had been isolated could meet regularly with patient communicators. He recommended art and movement classes because he had learned that communication went beyond just hand signs. The center began construction 6 months later. Richard named it the Margaret Stone Communication Center. When he told his mother about it through Marcus, she cried tears of joy. She had spent 78 years feeling invisible, and now her name would be on a building dedicated to making sure others never felt that way. Marcus was invited to speak at the groundbreaking ceremony. He stood at the microphone feeling nervous with dozens of people watching. He talked about how Margaret had taught him that every person had their own language of the heart. He said the key to understanding was not in learning rules but in paying attention with patience and respect. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Several deaf individuals in the crowd made signs of appreciation. Marcus saw their gestures and understood that this work was bigger than just him and Margaret. It was about dignity and recognition for all people who communicated in ways the world did not always understand. After the ceremony, Margaret gestured to Marcus that she was proud of him. She made the sign they had created together that meant family. Marcus was not related to her by blood, but they had formed a bond that went deeper than genetics. Betty stood beside Richard watching Marcus and Margaret together. She whispered to Richard that she could never have imagined this life for her grandson. Richard replied that Marcus had given him something more valuable than all his wealth combined. He had given him his mother back. As the sun set that evening, the four of them sat together in the penthouse. Margaret and Marcus communicated in their special language while Betty and Richard watched with full hearts. It was proof that connection could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth. Not everyone was happy about Marcus's sudden fame and the attention on Margaret's story. Some experts in deaf education criticized the approach, saying it was not systematic enough. They argued that teaching people to read individual gesture systems was inefficient when standard sign language already existed. These critics wrote articles and appeared on talk shows saying that Richard Stone was wasting money on a program that would not scale. They said Marcus was just one unusual child and his methods could not be replicated. The criticism hurt Marcus, even though Richard and Betty tried to shield him from it. He read some of the articles online and felt angry that people were dismissing what he and Margaret had built together. One professor wrote that Marcus was being exploited for feel-good stories, and that his time would be better spent in regular school. Marcus showed the article to Margaret and asked through gestures if what he was doing was wrong. Margaret took his hands in hers and made firm, clear gestures. She told him that people who had never been invisible could not understand what it felt like to finally be seen. She said critics always attacked what they did not understand. Marcus felt better after talking to Margaret, but the criticism continued to sting. At school, some kids who had ignored him before now made fun of him. They called him the gesture boy and mocked the way he moved his hands. A few teachers were resentful that Marcus was getting special attention and tutoring. They gave him harder assignments and graded him more strictly than other students. Marcus started to withdraw again. He still went to the penthouse every day, but he became quieter at school. Betty noticed the change and talked to Richard about it. Richard was furious when he learned that Marcus was being bullied. He wanted to intervene, but Betty convinced him to let Marcus work through it. She said her grandson needed to learn to stand up for himself. One day in class, the teacher asked students to present on someone they admired. Most kids chose athletes or musicians or actors. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood at the front of the room and talked about Margaret. He explained how she had lived 78 years without anyone truly understanding her. He described how she had created her own language and kept it alive in her memory for decades. He talked about the strength it took to keep trying to communicate when no one listened. Some students rolled their eyes, but others listened with genuine interest. One girl raised her hand and asked if Marcus could teach them some of Margaret's signs. Marcus was surprised by the question, but he demonstrated a few basic gestures. The girl and several other students tried to copy the movements. The teacher, who had been skeptical of Marcus, softened a bit. She admitted that what Marcus was doing was valuable, even if it was unconventional. She said maybe there was room for different approaches to communication. After class, the girl who had asked the question introduced herself as Claire. She said her little brother was autistic and did not speak much. She asked if Marcus's methods might help her understand her brother better. Marcus said he did not know, but he could try. He started spending lunch periods with Claire, teaching her to observe her brother's patterns and movements. Within a few weeks, Claire reported that she was beginning to understand what her brother wanted and needed. This opened up a new possibility. Marcus's approach was not just for deaf individuals with personal sign languages. It could help with anyone who communicated differently. Children with autism or speech disorders or developmental delays, adults who had strokes or brain injuries, anyone who fell outside the typical communication patterns. The university program expanded to include these populations. Marcus became even busier helping train people to work with diverse communicators. But he always made time for Margaret. She was his first teacher and his most important student. Margaret's health began to decline slowly. She was getting older and her body was wearing out. She developed problems with her heart and had to take more medications. Richard hired the best doctors, but they all said the same thing. Margaret was nearing the end of her life. Marcus noticed that Margaret was moving slower and gesturing with less energy. Some days she was too tired to have long conversations, but she always smiled when she saw him and made the sign for family. Richard asked Marcus to help him tell his mother something important. He wanted Margaret to know how much he loved her and how grateful he was for everything she had taught him. Marcus helped Richard learn to say these things in Margaret's language. It took weeks of practice, but finally Richard was able to communicate directly with his mother, without Marcus translating. The first time Richard made the signs himself, Margaret started crying. She had waited her whole life to have a real conversation with her son. Now in her final months, they could finally talk to each other. Marcus watched them together and felt proud of what they had accomplished. He had given them this gift of communication, and it was the most important thing he had ever done. Margaret Stone passed away peacefully in her sleep on a quiet Tuesday morning, 3 years after Marcus first met her. She was 81 years old and had spent her final years surrounded by people who understood her. Richard was devastated, but also grateful. His mother had not died alone and isolated. She had died knowing she was heard and valued and loved. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Many were family members of individuals who had been helped by the communication program. Some were deaf people who had learned about Margaret's story and felt inspired by it. Students from the university came to pay respects. Teachers and researchers and families all gathered to honor a woman who had lived most of her life in silence, but whose impact was now being heard around the country. Marcus was asked to give a eulogy. He was 13 years old now and had grown taller, but his voice was still quiet and thoughtful. He stood at the front of the church and talked about the first time he met Margaret. He described how she had been sitting by the window looking lonely, and how something had pulled him toward her. He explained that Margaret had taught him the most important lesson of his life, which was that everyone has something to say if you take the time to listen. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He began to speak in Margaret's language using the gestures she had created. Most people in the church did not understand the signs, but they understood the emotion behind them. Marcus was saying goodbye in the language that only he and a few others could speak. He told Margaret's story without words, just as she had lived it. Richard watched from the front row with tears streaming down his face. He saw his mother's language being honored and preserved. He knew that even though Margaret was gone, her way of communicating would live on through Marcus and the programs they had created together. After the funeral, the Margaret Stone Communication Center officially opened its doors. It was a beautiful building with classrooms and therapy rooms and gathering spaces. The walls were decorated with photos of Margaret and artwork created by deaf individuals. There was a library filled with documentation of personal sign languages that had been collected and preserved. Marcus became a regular teacher at the center even though he was still in school himself. He worked with families and taught them his observation methods. He showed them how to look for patterns and how to respond with patience. Not everyone could do what Marcus did, but many people improved their ability to connect with loved ones who communicated differently. The university program continued to grow and expand to other cities. Richard funded satellite centers in 5 different states. Students graduated with specializations in alternative communication and went on to work in schools and hospitals and care facilities. They carried forward the philosophy that every person's way of communicating deserved respect and attention. Marcus finished high school with top grades and received scholarship offers from multiple universities. He chose to study linguistics and psychology so he could better understand the science behind what he had been doing intuitively. But he never lost his gift for observation and connection. In college, Marcus met other students who had experienced being misunderstood or overlooked. He formed study groups and support networks. He taught his methods to anyone interested in learning. Some of his friends became communication specialists. Others went into education or social work or therapy. They all shared a belief that understanding required more than just language. Betty retired from housekeeping and became the coordinator of family services at the Margaret Stone Communication Center. She worked with families who were struggling to communicate with loved ones. She understood their frustration and fear because she had watched her own grandson navigate those challenges. Richard remained involved with the center and the university program, but he also spent more time on personal philanthropy. He donated to schools in poor neighborhoods and funded scholarships for children like Marcus who showed promise but lacked resources. He set up a foundation in his mother's name that would continue the work long after he was gone. Marcus never forgot the lessons Margaret had taught him. Even as he grew older and gained more formal education, he remembered that the most important skill was simply paying attention. He remembered that people who seemed silent often had the most important things to say. Years later, when Marcus was in his 20s, he received an invitation to speak at a national conference on communication disorders. He stood on stage in front of thousands of professionals and told the story of Margaret Stone. He explained how a 78-year-old deaf woman and a 10-year-old boy had found a way to bridge the silence between them. He challenged the audience to think differently about communication. He said too often experts tried to fit people into existing systems rather than learning to understand each person as an individual. He argued that every human being deserved to be understood in their own language, whatever that language might be. The speech was met with a standing ovation. Several people in the audience approached Marcus afterward to share their own stories. A woman told him about her grandfather who had dementia and could no longer speak but still tried to communicate through gestures. A man described his daughter who was deaf and blind and had developed her own tactile language. Each person thanked Marcus for validating their experiences and giving them hope. Marcus realized that the work he and Margaret had started would never be finished. There would always be people who fell through the cracks of conventional communication systems. There would always be individuals who needed someone to take the time to truly see and hear them. But now there were more people trained to do that work and more awareness of its importance. Betty watched her grandson speak at the conference and felt overwhelming pride. She thought about the quiet boy who used to sit on the apartment steps watching people. She remembered bringing him to the penthouse that first day, never imagining what would come from it. She realized that sometimes the most important moments in life happen by accident or by chance. Richard attended the conference too, sitting in the back row. He listened to Marcus speak about his mother and felt the familiar mixture of sadness and gratitude. Margaret had missed so much in her life because of her isolation. But in her final years, she had experienced true connection. She had shared her stories and been understood. She had formed a bond with a young boy who became like a grandson to her. Most importantly, she had inspired a movement that was helping countless others avoid the loneliness she had endured. As Marcus finished his speech and left the stage, Richard caught up with him in the hallway. They embraced like family because that is what they had become. Richard told Marcus that his mother would be proud. Marcus replied that everything he had accomplished was because Margaret had trusted him enough to try. They walked out of the conference center together along with Betty. 3 people from completely different worlds who had been brought together by an elderly woman's silent plea to be understood. They had become a family not through blood but through shared purpose and love. The sun was setting as they stood outside talking about future plans for the center and the program. Marcus looked up at the sky and made a gesture that he and Margaret had created together. It meant remembering with love. Richard recognized the sign and made it back. Betty joined them and they stood together in silence, making the gesture that honored Margaret's memory. People walking past might have wondered what the three of them were doing, but Marcus and Richard and Betty knew exactly what they were saying. They were speaking in a language of the heart that transcended words. They were proving that understanding was always possible if someone cared enough to try, and they were carrying forward the legacy of a deaf woman who had lived most of her life in silence, but whose voice now echoed through the work of everyone she had touched.